Many thanks for joining us. My name is Claire Armani. I'm chair of the Design History Society, and I'm delighted that you've come to be part of our second DHS Dialogue, focusing on ideas of digital agency. But before we launch into these wonderful three interventions that were very generously proposed to us, I just wanted to thank you all for being a part of a design history event. We are a charity which is very much engaged in trying to facilitate design history activity of all kinds, from the most open of outreach events right the way through to sort of learned academic scholarship. We have a whole set of grant making opportunities. We have an annual conference. We also have an academic journal, as many of you may know. And Jenna will put in the chat box a link tree, which just helps you to connect to all of those ways that we'd love to help you in your lives as design historians in all kinds of permutations. So having done that sort of celebration of the Design History Society, I also wanted to celebrate the activity which we're all engaged in, which is thinking about this complex dialogue between the task of representation as a kind of crafting of thinking through craft as an activity, as an identity, as a practice. So that sort of dualism, I'm very excited about the way in which our speakers are opening that up into a much more multifarious, multivalent kind of way of thinking. Now, as you will know, there's 6 dialogues that we're exploring. So this second one is introducing this element of the digital. So our first conversation very much explored ideas of labor in relationship to craft. This one is trying to fold in the ways in which craft practices, which so often have been defined by their distance from the technological, the mechanical, actually intersect very meaningfully with those other ways of working, and even more so in our digital age. So it's my enormous pleasure, if we might go to the next slide, Jenna, to introduce the first of our 3 speakers, which is Shannon Black. One of the other delights of having done this sort of worldwide call is what a wonderfully worldwide response we've had. Each of our dialogues is involving at least 3 geographies, if not 4 or 5. So it's wonderful to have the North American context speaking to us. I always feel I shouldn't start these conversations with a time of day. It's a sort of greeting rather than a good morning or a good afternoon or a good evening. So wonderful to have that global perspective. And equally, the interdisciplinarian within me is delighted at the different intellectual context that each of our presenters is bringing to bear today. So Shannon Platt, very much coming from the world of cultural and feminist geography, will be speaking to us about visualizing change, online representation and resistance in the Canada-US hand knitting industry. So over to Shannon and her slide.
Thank you so much, Claire, for the warm introduction. It's my pleasure to be here this afternoon, my time, in the evening, your time. I'm really excited to be a part of this discussion today, but I'm aware that we only have about 10 minutes for our presentation, so I'm going to jump right into it. So as Claire introduced, I am going to be talking to you a little bit about some research that I've done as a part of with my dissertation work that's related to online representation and resistance within the Canada-US hand knitting industry. And so this research started with an observation that in recent years in the global north, in particular in Canada and the United States, there's been this resurgence of craft. And in particular, the domestic crafts, so sewing and hand knitting and so on and so forth. And the second observation that followed from that was that increasingly crafters, these subset of crafters, are turning to visual and digital mediums such as photography and social media, as well as other kind of platforms in an effort to showcase their work, exchange creative ideas, cultivate communities, and generate businesses. And while the social sciences, which is where I come from as a human and cultural geographer, there's a handful of examples that begin to address contemporary craft in online contexts. The ways in which inequities in general and racial inequities in particular circulate within craft sectors, and importantly, how they manifest, articulate, and are struggled against via visual and digital media require more study. And so combining the testimonies of 42 crafters and craft intermediaries working within the Canada-US hand knitting industry with visual and discourse analysis of photos and comments posted on knitting-themed Instagram accounts and blogs, in this paper, I begin to address this gap. And in doing so, I aim to center a conversation around the role of visual and digital media in the struggle for racial equity within the Canada-US hand knitting sector. And further to that, I hope to provoke a broader discussion or conversation about the intersection between visual and digital media, equity, and craft. And so to sort of set the context for this research, I want to begin on January 7th, 2019. And on this particular day in the knitting community on Instagram, it became a hotbed of political debate. And it began with this problematic post that was uploaded by a prominent American knitwear blogger, an online shop owner named Karen Templer. And in this post, Ms. Templer wrote about an upcoming trip to India. And here I quote her words. She says, "I've always wanted to go to India for as long as I can remember. One of my closest friends is Indian, and her family had offered back then if I ever wanted to go with them on one of their trips, I could. To a suburban Midwestern American teenager with a severe anxiety disorder, it was like being offered offered a seat on a flight to Mars. It was fun to think about, but are you kidding me? I've always wanted to go to India, and now I think if I can do anything, I'm pretty sure," end quote. The post garnered numerous comments ranging from support and enthusiasm to pointed criticisms of the ways in which her post reinforced an othering or Orientalist mindset. And on Ms. Templer's Instagram page, where the blog post was reposted, many comments referred to the personal pain that the post caused and that remaining silent on such twin issues of racial privilege and discrimination in the knitting industry was no longer an option. And then these comments spread rapidly throughout the internet, and in particular the online community, a knitting community, through links and hashtags and repostings. And debates quickly shifted from Ms. Templer's comments to the broader issues of racism, race-based discrimination, and whiteness in the hand knitting industry. And I should also point out that up until Karen Templer's post in 2019, my research suggests that discussions about racism and whiteness within the knitting industry typically occurred in semi-private spaces of community knitting circles, as well as certain yarn stores owned by women of color in particular, and also in particular geographical locations such as New York City. And these conversations very well could be happening online also, but my research did not explore that aspect. And the reason that these conversations were happening in these semi-private spaces is due to an overwhelming sentiment amongst many white industry actors that the knitting industry is a space of inclusivity and support, and that knitting is an accessible activity which is open to all. However, many Black, Indigenous, and people of color crafters in the hand knitting industry, including designers, hand dyers, yarn store owners, and customers, face a host of micro and macro barriers as they navigate a white-dominated sector. And these aggressions are linked, at least in part, to a persistent coding of craft in general and knitting in particular as white. And through this featuring of white knitting subjects in paintings and photography and advertising and in popular media, the centering of white perspectives and voices in research and storytelling, white, middle-class, able-bodied, heterosexual, and cisgendered women have become synonymous with the identity of knitter in Canada and the United States. And this has contributed to a whitewashing of the industry and helped to normalize racial as well as class privilege that is associated with having the time and economic, cultural, and social capital to engage with knitting, be it for leisure, work, or political engagement. And in the contemporary period, again, in the North American or Canadian and US context, this coding of knitting as white has influenced hiring and contractual practices, representational and advertising trends, and it has also contributed to a normalization of racist ideas about who can knit and who belongs in knitting related spaces. And here, Black, Indigenous, and people of color crafters must perpetually justify their place within knitting related activities and spaces. And this often requires taking on a constant psychological labor of educating white customers and colleagues about discrimination, racism, and white racial privilege. And this labor, I should point out, is uncompensated. It often goes unacknowledged or is met with rebuttal or silence. This said, within this context, Black, Indigenous, and people of color crafters have agency. And in one of the spaces in which this agency is enacted is through the use of visual and digital media. And so by using Instagram in particular, BIPOC designers, hand dyers, and shop owners share and make visible their creative outputs, their labor, their lived experiences, histories, and politics in ways that are self-determined. And in doing so, they build successful businesses, consumer bases, networks, and communities. And through the posting and circulation of a range of images, including historical photographs, as well as iPhone selfies, group shots, and professional editorial photos, these crafters produce counter visualities. And in doing so, they break a euphoric panorama of the authoritative white gaze. And in doing so, these counter visualities become a strategy for looking back, to use the late Bell Hooks's words. And through this process, BIPOC crafters create and transform visual and material spaces into sites of autonomy and agency, collectivity, and inclusion. And the ongoing efforts of Black, Indigenous, and people of color crafters and their allies have begun to shift conversations around racism and representation, as well as whiteness in the knitting industry. And over the last 3 years or so, this has been evidenced by, for example, an increased number of white industry actors now actively using their Instagram accounts as spaces in which to pledge solidarity and demonstrate their commitment to anti-racist self-education. We also see it in the ways that organizations and companies, as well as festivals, have reworked their mission statements and adjust their hiring practices to mandate greater inclusivity and diversity within their businesses and organizations. Magazine publishers have also begun to actively publish on the need for inclusion and diversity in the industry and to feature BIPOC designers and models in their publications. And also online knitting intermediaries such as Ravelry.com in the past 3 years has banned content in support of now former American President Donald Trump in their attempt to address the connections between everyday racisms, individual microaggressions, and larger structures of white supremacy. However, just as these important changes are taking place, online racism, as well as racism offline, persists. And the way that this is manifesting in the knitting industry, for example, is the ways in which some white crafters continue to gaslight BIPOC crafters, stating that politics should be kept separate from knitting, or that BIPOC crafters are, quote, overreacting, while often describing themselves as victims, claiming that they are unjustly attacked online, misunderstood, bullied, innocent for expressing their views. And then there's also a less vocal subset of crafters who persistently withdraw from engagement around issues related to racial equity, discrimination, and whiteness in online contexts. And my research suggests that this withdrawal is fueled in part by the ways in which online engagement might negatively impact their businesses and their livelihoods, or how comments online can be misread and misjudged, or there is this, quote, knee-jerk reaction to political posts that many have witnessed. Also having been the recipient of online aggression or wanting to maintain a, quote, safe space for knitting, or to keep social media feeds a place of creativity and inspiration, or other reasons that some disassociate knitting, online media, and business from issues of politics and social justice. And these quiet racisms, rather than overt acts of violence and hate, make it difficult to better understand and contend with the ways in which white supremacy is built into the spaces and activities of the hand knitting industry. And in doing so, quiet racism helped to perpetuate a narrative that knitting in the knitting community is unthreatening and good intentioned, and that those who call for a more direct approach to confronting these issues in the knitting industry are somehow misguided, disruptive, and dangerous. And so in conclusion, as we attempt to better understand representation and resistance in the hand knitting industry and to evaluate the transformative potential of using visual and digital tools and spaces to confront race-based inequities, as well as hierarchies and erasures within this sector, we must continually ask, how are platforms serving productive and substantive anti-racist work, for whom and to what effect? And as we do this, scholar Jesse Daniels argues, we must traverse the narrow ledge between the all too common rhetoric of moral panic over the dangers of the internet and the uncritical glee over digital media's transformative potential. And by navigating this edge requires multiple literacies. It includes the literacy of digital media, anti-racism, and social justice. And I suggest it also requires shifting our focus towards exploring the differentiated embodied knowledges of those who use digital platforms, and in the case that I present here, those who craft. Thank you very much.
And Shannon, thank you so much for setting us up so evocatively. My habit when I'm teaching is to applaud in this way now in our digital world. So let me applaud on behalf of all of our audience for a tremendous start. So many thanks for that. I promised I won't do questions in between, so each of our speakers sort of gets their chance. But if people want to help remind themselves of questions they want to ask later, you're very welcome to type this into the chat, and then I'll sort of walk through those when we have completed all three presentations. So many thanks, Shannon. Jen, if we might progress to the next slide. It's my enormous pleasure to introduce our second contributor. Again, the inner joy of how we've got presentations from people working in such connected and distinctive ways into our subject matter. So Laya Chiravaru is part of a practice-based world of fashion making within the context of the Indian subcontinent, but also has this historical approach in her own research and methodology. So a wonderful contributor to our conversation today. And we're shifting our context thereby from North America. Let's swing our globe around. And we're now looking, as I say, at the Indian subcontinent, crafting the internal other. Thank you so much, Leah. We look forward to it.
Hello, hi. I'm very excited to present today. Thank you for having me on the panel. So this has been my master's research, but I only selectively chose one part of it because of the time constraint that we have today. So my topic is about the representational strategies in Indian crafts, specifically addressing sustainable fashion today. Crafts and craft-based activities in India have found a new encouragement today because they play a vital role in the sustainable development goals of the country. Most crafts have been environmentally friendly, and they generate employment to a large population of artisans, and they also contribute greatly to the economy, both locally and also through foreign trade. So they support all three pillars of sustainability. So especially with this growing awareness about sustainability and sustainable fashion, both of which have turned into buzzwords today, sadly, there is a visible spotlight on the artisan and the village, because most crafts have been mostly produced in the rural India by people of the rural India. So we have a rich diversity of crafts, which is definitely advantageous in this debate about sustainability agenda specifically. We have a craft advantage. Now, to decode this growing awareness about sustainability, if we take an example of one of the most popular brands in the country, which is Fab India, which caters craft-based fashion to the middle and upper middle class market. So they have this banner on their website, which is figure 1 here, where they say Fab India connects her and 55,000 others like her to you. The lady in the picture is doing some embroidery and she is clearly an artisan. And in another instance in the picture below, the brand has invited people, artisans to their shop floor to demonstrate their craft to the customers who visit the store. So what is fascinating here is that it's typically artisans from the tribal communities of India, the Rabadi and the Lambani tribal communities, who compose this picture here. So why this choice of artisans? So if you look into the colonial history of India, this spotlight on the rural craft worker is not actually a new theme. In the colonial history, exhibitions played a very important role, especially in London. There was the Great Exhibition in 1851 at the Crystal Palace, where Indian artifacts were displayed and praised for their exquisite craftsmanship, whereas the tools that produced them were considered very simple and very primitive compared to the industrial machinery of the West. And then in 1885, a living ethnological display was hosted at the Liberties departmental store in London. Figure 5 here shows the Liberties Indian village, where you can see that the whole atmosphere, it's composed with not only rural craftsmen, but dancers, performers, snake charmers, constructing the image of the colonial other, which was significant to the discourse of Orientalism. And then it was repeated in 1886 for the colonial and Indian exhibition in London. Figure 2 and figure 6 here show the Indian artisans who were recruited to compose an India under the English sky. The Royal Committee, which was responsible for organizing this exhibition, reported that their selection criteria were for the artisans were not only to include diverse trades, but specifically those that would prove more interesting to the public. And the Indian village was interesting to the public because it represented an uncorrupted primitive colony compared to the urban advancements of the West. It was ironically a preservationist approach of salvaging and celebrating the pure and real India, which is supposed to be the rural India, from the harsh effects of industrialization. And now, if we switch back to the contemporary marketing strategies of sustainable fashion today, if we see figure 1 again, certainly not all 55,000 artisans that engage with the brand look like her. That's not what the banner is trying to say. It implies that she is the index of an entire category called artisans, that she symbolizes her kind. Now, when you have a huge diversity of craft workers, representation is a creative challenge. So this quintessential internal other who is starkly distinct in her dressing and social profile is repeatedly used as an icon, both for an emotional narrative of sustaining livelihoods or an exotic narrative of celebrating and embracing diversity. Now, it's not specific to only one brand. It's not just one brand that's doing this. Figure 3 here is from a social media post of another fashion brand, which has posted, and it says, reviving age-old tradition in the purest form of Indian craft. And there you can see these vats of dyes and muddy buildings, but that's not India, that's Morocco. That's a leather tannery in Fez, Morocco. But almost no one suspects that because it more or less looks like an Indian village, especially with that sepia filter. So the debate I'm raising here is India has absorbed a colonial mindset, and it has internalized this colonial mindset through narratives that were produced and reproduced at historical political junctures. And the village and the artisans throughout history have represented a symbolic cultural purity as the past version of India that was lost somewhere due to modernity. And this past present dichotomy fits very well today with the sustainable agendas, because now we are going back to our roots and we're taking this U-turn. So how do we project that? How do we project that we are relooking at our past by idolizing the apparent happy primitivism of the village and the artisan? So the pressing issue is about cultural sustainability. What forms of images are we preserving, projecting, and reinforcing in this quest for sustainable fashion? But actually, another important angle to this debate is fashion. It's a system, it's the system of fashion which has gained this corrupt reputation as a corrupt industry exploiting garment workers, typically located in the countries of the global south. So now discussions on sustainability have given rise to this new form of activism, with Fashion Revolution starting the Who Made My Clothes campaign. So people want to know who is making their clothes. They want to see images of garment workers, the conditions of these factories and workshops, and rightfully so, because the point is to establish transparency in the supply chain, to establish traceability and accountability. But then again, in India, this whole discussion about who made my clothes, this has recast a spotlight on the craft worker. And this is definitely not the whole picture, because certainly there are craft organizations which are addressing community specific needs of the artisans. There are NGOs and institutions working closely to nurture artisanal communities, and they are encouraging artisans to acquire digital literacy, to narrate their own stories in their own voice, to bring their produce to the market themselves through online platforms. There are artisans who have created their websites to do away with middlemen and regain that agency and control. So good work is happening in many different ways. But all of that somehow goes unnoticed, because in the mainstream consumer culture, popular brands with huge social acceptance have turned this narrative into a marketing agenda. Meanwhile, the consumer, I mean, one of the interview partners I had who was a consumer, she says that when they look at these images, it instills them with the confidence to trust the brand, that they know that their livelihoods are being supported, which means that the artisan and the village correspond to the present notions of cultural purity and timelessness associated with sustainability. And it's because of that social pressure created by sustainability, by this global buzzword, that the otherizing gets intensified through this visual culture today. Because the quintessential internal other is the apparent benefactor of this conscious consumerism. And the more distinct their appearance is from that of an urban consumer, the more this emotional satisfaction of sustaining their livelihoods. Whereas nobody really combs through the supply chain realities. But again, supply chain is a debate for another time. I'll conclude here. Yeah. Thank you.
Oh, thank you so much, Shaya. That's wonderful. A really thought-provoking presentation, and lots of nice synergies already between the two. So many thanks for that. But I will restrain myself for questions until the last session. So Jenna, if we might proceed to our third presentation, which is all the richer for involving three presenters, which is, you know, a wonderful demonstration of another strand of our conversation, which is the collaborative nature of digital agency in a lot of the contexts that we've been exploring so far. So trying to capture 3 different speakers. So we have 2 colleagues coming from the School of Communications at the Royal College of Art, sort of one set of discursive positions, and then wonderful to have a collaborative colleague joining us from Brazil, Tila Matsunaga, speaking to the nature of these transnational projects that they're undertaking. So we're all very much looking forward to hearing how that's worked for you, thinking through the critical ethics for communicating Indigenous craft practices. So Jenna, the next slide, if I may, and thank you so much. I'll hand over to the 3 of you.
Thank you, Claire, for your very thoughtful introduction and for your superb chairing on keeping us all moving here. Before we begin, Celia, Matt, and I would like to acknowledge our positioning as educators working within established universities and in a research project supported by government funding. This brings certain complexities to craft-based community partnerships in ways that might challenge Western-centric approaches to thinking, making, and our practices as co-researchers. So we acknowledge the complexity of communication processes, and especially those which reach across geographies, languages, cultures, and traditions. So our presentation raises questions about the roles that critical ethics and communication design practice play in a process of representation of Indigenous craft knowledge and traditional cultural heritage. To help elucidate some of these complexities, we highlight a few salient ethical questions from our current research project. Funded by the British Council, our 6-month pilot project aims to build a virtual library for the future by bringing together the inhabitants of the Munduruku village located on a tributary of the Amazon River in partnership with the Royal College of Art and the University of Brasilia. Our questions for the purposes of this presentation revolve around the ethics of consent, co-researching, storytelling, and digital responsibility. Rooted in cooperative practices, this project responds to an impassioned call from the chief of the village, Cacique Domingos Munduruku, who remarks, "Families don't have access to information. We need a project to improve communication. We know the importance of education." Our research sets out to address an already co-identified need for the development of cooperative communication practices and digital inclusion methods, to foster new ways of shared learning that build upon and rediscover local craft traditions and Indigenous knowledge. These things are in danger of being lost in the face of a changing political landscape. I'd like to now turn to Celia. You have you're muted, Celia. There you go.
Yeah. Thank you, everyone. And I'll talk about Munduruku. Who are they? In the first half of the 19th century, the Munduruku were among the people of the Brazilian lowlands best known in Europe. They were not only admired for their capability as warriors, but first of all, for the beauty of their feather work, their artistic tattoos and body paint, and their mummified head trophies. The territory inhabited by them was larger than at the present. The knowledge relating to the manufacture and uses of their traditional feather ornament has disappeared among the Munduruku of today for more than 100 years. Nowadays, within the population of 13,750 people, 38 clans live on the bankside of the Tapajós River in the Amazon, where the cultural life has undergone changes. The school became very important for the Munduruku, and they have also been concerned with improving the indigenous school education system. Together with indigenous organization, literacy must also become the main instrument of indigenous ethnicity and political reaffirmation. As a material culture, the production of the basketry and braiding male common activities The making of basket in which women will use to carry the fruits and products of the land from the small Sweden's household utensils are the responsibility of women, being made with natural fibers of aroma, a plant found in the flood areas such as spring and bank of stream and forest areas. Men and women share the making of necklaces with figures of fish, alligators, turtles, snake, etc. Many of them are made using tucumán seeds, a typical palm tree from the Amazon. Pottery is an activity that has almost disappeared in the Munduruku culture. In the village of Bragança, where our project is situated, some effort has been made to strengthen this practice, which is still quite rudimentary compared to the past. Weaving, which use cotton nets, is also in disuse. Some activities are still preserved or even recreated with new meanings, respecting the hunted animals and the daily practice of hunters to obtain food. Fishing is one of the most important Munduruku cultural practice. I'd like to turn to Theo again. Thank you.
We propose in this project that everyone involved is a co-researcher. The project aims to develop through agreed actions a way of doing, leading to a cooperative approach and fostering other ways of knowing. Though we are working together, ethically, we must ensure a sustainable process through which the repository continues to build toward a village library for the future. Consent. The consideration of orally recorded informed consent and group culture communities recognizing the leader's authority has been key to the project's processes. Informed consent is integrated into every stage of the project. Process work and documentation resulting from digital-based participatory workshops, audiovisual inclusive storytelling sessions, evaluative interviews, podcast, photographs, drawings, and observations are co-curated between partners, including the chief, Cacique Domingos, and authors of these works to ensure appropriate representation on the virtual repository. I'd like to turn to Matt.
Thank you, Teal. Storytelling is a key to this research, alongside an awareness of visual and oral traditions of the Munduruku. Robin Wall Kimura proposes in a book, Braiding Sweetgrass, that there is power in the telling, though she rightly asks who will tell them. We would add there is equal power in the showing or the playing of. Virtual Libraries Repository. This project seeks to evaluate the process of Indigenous education, considering the use of technological devices connected to and through the internet, such as mobile phones, pads, and computers. The main objective being the construction or implementation of an Indigenous public library model that will assist elementary and high school students. Besides that, contribute to the development of pedagogical use of technology in order to help the learning process, whilst at the same time to give the excluded population access to digital inclusion. Local telecommunication practice is the central kind of fulcrum to the project's documentation. The preferred digital platform for some of the meetings being Google Meet, and WhatsApp seems to be the go-to place for which undirected video and audio, mobile phone recordings, photographs, and text, for example, are sent and collected. But these platforms are nonetheless offer forms of connection and communication, but are often problematic. The compression algorithms employed by platforms such as Meet or Microsoft Teams are predicated towards the production of highly standardized compressed listening and viewing experiences. There's a functional rationale for this, the processing for audio, for example, to optimize speech, intelligibility, drawing on knowledge from accessibility tools such as hearing aids. But there's a lot that's lost in this process. So we're mindful that all these forms of communication and collection, although they've allowed us to act expediently and to connect us in a way that might not have been possible a decade or so ago, we also need to reflect on what these machines edit out. The teachers in the community have asked us to produce short how-to podcasts around basic skill sets, computing, photography, music. to help the students in the village school with English skills as well as basic operating of computers, cameras and so forth. A short process film and photographs are currently being produced without direction. But this raises interesting tension between a Western way of photographing demonstrated through the knowledge of technical skills and the ways in which the community is already just using and representing craft and processes by providing imagery through mobile phone usage. What might change if this Western-centric view of representation is introduced through videos and podcasts? And secondly, by introducing enhanced forms of digital technologies into the village, what is our role in terms of technology, knowledge and digital responsibility? How can we ensure sustainability of access to these technologies, access that goes beyond a tokenistic taster of tools of production and reproduction? To conclude, as this research is an ethnographic approach focused on the Munduruku culture, the investigations carried out so far have on the sad reality experienced by these traditional peoples, the intricate relationships of identity conflicts, lack of subsistence, health and education, and the constant threats to their territories by loggers, land grabbers and farmers. Turning our attention to indigenous peoples today is crucial. However, the work directly related to this population isn't simple. When we talk about ethics in conducting ethnographic research and design, the challenges for us are very broad. To quote Igor Chanran, each ethnical group is distinguished by its own cultural personality, which is unique in nature, is not limited to understanding attitudes and reactions to the new and strange things. The understanding of this specific nature, thus, is a task of utmost importance for us and for those who seek to understand this reality. In addition, its fundamental focus on the concern with protecting the environment, cultural and religious values, and maintaining the integrity of the people of the Amazon, their cultural legacy, material and immaterial heritage, in addition to strengthening actions that can prevent the destruction of the Amazon rainforest. Thank you.